Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me out there? Yeah. Great. Okay, hi. So I'm here to talk to you today about my game, Pallas of Vines. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about expressive musical gameplay, but I'm going to demonstrate a lot what I mean by that. Because I know, coming from a research background, expressive is a very subjective term, and I've had to talk about that a lot. So I'm just going to show you what I mean and hopefully just plant the seed in your heads as developers or players or whatever you're here to do to explore what expressive means to you. So first of all, about me, my name is Alexander Thumm. I have a background in multimedia art and experimental game design. I've been an electronic music composer, performer, and software designer for over 15 years. I have a degree in music technology, and I am currently at the end of a PhD researching expressive musical performance in gameplay. So Pallas of Vines is also my PhD thesis, and now I'm working with a team to commercialize it also. So just as an example of my kind of experimental gaming background, this came out of the early stages of my research prototyping. This was a commission for a string quartet. And that's me doing a live performance there on my laptop with a MIDI controller. So I'm using a combination of keyboard and mouse and MIDI controller, which is just dials and faders. And the audience is in front of me, so they can see on screen exactly what I'm doing inside the game. And the string quartet is just off to the side, to my left there. And they're also facing the screen, hearing what's happening in the game and playing in response to it, but also playing in response to the visuals. So that's just kind of one example of what I'm doing with the MIDI controller is very dynamic and expressive, but I'm also having this real-world dialogue through the screen and the speakers. So what I'm going to show you today is my research, as I've said. It's part performance game and part musical adventure, and I'm going to show you both of those parts separately so that you can understand what I mean by that and why I've done it that way. So this is what Pallas of Vines currently looks like. It's been 3 years just about of research, so it's gone through lots of prototype iterations and many, many changes. And I'm not going to go into the technical details because I'd like to kind of keep this open and broad, and because I'm going to show the game, which is kind of going to speak for itself. But as Unity people, if you're interested in how this kind of thing works behind the scenes in Unity, I'm happy to talk to you about that afterwards or in the question session at the end. So what I mean by expressive musical gameplay, I'll just show you straight up in Pallas. So I'm going to do a few separate sections of performing like this. The first one I'm just going to kind of talk through so that it makes sense step by step what I'm doing, and things that you might be expecting to happen wouldn't necessarily happen. So the first thing that I have to kind of introduce is that the listener is not attached to the camera as you would probably expect it to be. The listener is attached directly to the avatar. These things here are all holding samples. So just for the purpose of this kind of demonstration, I'm going to do a sample-based kind of performance. You can also do synthesis, or you can do live mic line input. So what's happening here, hopefully you're getting panning, because I'm not getting any up here. But so you should be, when the avatar is rotating, you should be getting the left-right panning relative to like the avatar's head. So it doesn't matter where the camera is, and that has no impact. It totally matters where the avatar is. And this is something that came up through prototyping. And the reason for that being is that I can do this. That avatar is there, and that's the single listener of that object. So now I can bring in another sound, and I can have a separate listener for that. So what I'm also doing now is adding an effect to that, just to make it more interesting. So I've just got a delay effect added to that sound source. And you can see this sound source up here is just kind of staying stable. This one here is attached to this avatar. And I can also dynamically change them. So say if I just want this avatar to listen to both of those sounds, then I've just reassigned it. So now he's mixing between those. And I can kind of do the same with the effects. I can group up the effects so that Now this delay effect is attached to both of those sound sources. And so basically, I mean, the effects are an interesting case because they, in themselves, they are actually nothing. They are just the parameters for that effect. So the effects actually, each sound source is basically also its own channel. And there are different ways to handle that. For example, if I was doing it in Wise, you would do that with buses. But interesting side note that Wise can't actually do this kind of thing on the fly yet. You could pre-set it to do this kind of thing, but that kind of defeats the purpose of having a freeform expressive system to do it in. So just to kind of give another brief thing before, as I said, I won't go too much into it this time. This is just to show you how the basics work. So this is like a phaser effect now. And I can change the parameters of any of those effects. So if I put, say, an LFO effect on there, then you'll be able to really hear easily what that effect is doing. And all the parameters, they just share like float values. So whether it's a dial or these pole kind of things, which are like the equivalent of faders, I could say attach that to the avatar's proximity. And then the proximity to those objects is what's determining the distance. And so say if I wanted to keep that sound stable, then I can use another avatar to be controlling those. And then if I wanted to hook that up to, say, lighting and control the lighting or control some coloration or whatever, it's all the same because it's all float values. So, you know, when you start kind of thinking in this way of what can be dynamic, you know, basically everything can be dynamic. So as you can see, we can have those fields that determines the proximity. So if you want just a small proximity from which the avatar can hear the sound. And the same goes for effects, in which case it's wet-dry. So if I want none of that effect applied, then I can just shrink the field down. If I want lots of it applied, then I can make it grow. And then if I have an effect attached to multiple sound sources, as I do in this case, then it's, you know, it's also relative to the distance to that sound source. So bringing it closer is also going to affect the wet-dry. So that's the briefest overview. I'll go back to my talk, and then I'm going to come back into this in a minute and just kind of do a bit of a performance without talking. So what is musical gameplay more broadly? From speaking to a lot of people in lots of different countries and from lots of different kind of gaming and non-gaming backgrounds, the first thing that people tend to think of is rhythm games. And I think obviously because Guitar Hero and Rock Band have been kind of the biggest commercial successes in recent times in terms of music games. And even in terms of the less commercially successful but still well-known indie games, you have things which are still kind of rhythm paradigms. So things like Res, for example, and Lumens, and a little more obscure ones like Parappa the Rapper. They all still kind of come under that that banner of you're pressing buttons in time with the backing track of the game, basically. So Electroplankton, this is one I'm consistently surprised that a lot of people actually seem to know about this and have like fond memories of it, which is really good. But a lot of people, I've used musical toys in inverted commas because a lot of people say that to the game's detriment, like it's not really a game, which is an interesting discussion to have, and I don't want to get into it. But I think this is a really interesting experiment, whatever you want to call it, because for those of you who don't know it, it was a Nintendo DS game. It uses the touchscreen, and it's really based on gesture. So in the context of this talk, this is kind of an example. It is really expressive, and it doesn't score you. It doesn't tell you whether you've got it right or wrong. It just says, here's a bunch of like 10 little mini games. Just make some music and see what you make. You know, see what you make of it. I mean, it does kind of handhold in the sense of you can't really make anything that sounds bad or sounds very dissonant. But at least it does kind of go just explore whatever you want to explore, which I really like. Kind of the linchpin of this talk is going to be two key games, and this is Brian Moriarty's Loom, and hopefully, actually, can I just see like a show of hands who knows Loom or who's played it? Oh, good, yeah, that's what I thought, cool. So about half of you. And I'm going to talk about Loom and Ocarina of Time together a lot. And I actually saw Brian Moriarty give a post-mortem on Loom and make this comparison. And as soon as he did, I was like, oh yeah, they are almost the same mechanic. And I'm not saying that Ocarina copied it or whatever, but it's just interesting to note that the way the melody-based mechanic works in both games is very similar, but obviously, for anyone who's played them, they're totally different games. So you all know Ocarina of Time, I assume, right? Cool. So what about expressive gameplay then? What are my terms for what's expressive? I'm not trying to say that there's this universal thing of this is expressive and this isn't expressive. And in research, I've had to define for myself what I believe is expressive, and I don't want to go into that because it's kind of boring. So just seeing the way that my game works is one idea of what I'm trying to explain as being expressive. So rhythm games tend to focus on copying someone else's music or synchronizing gameplay to a backing track. So something like Crypt of the Necrodancer, I believe, and I could be wrong about this because I haven't played it, but I think you're synchronizing your actions to the music. So you're still like listening based, but you're not actually, it's not asking you to create the music. They typically have no story to emotionally amplify a player's musical involvement, and again, that's not in all cases. So generally in gameplay and fictional engagement, they're minimally expressive. But that's not to say also that that's a bad thing, because they're still very dynamic games, right? It's, they're like exciting, and there's a sense of motion and speed, and that you're being a part of the music. And I think that's giving the player a sense of dynamically being a part of the music is still a wonderful thing. So Loom and Ocarina of Time both have this strong sense of story and emotional engagement, but they don't explore any more mechanic than the melody-based puzzles. And that's not to say they need to. They do it very well. But if we take that in a historical context, Loom was 1990, Ocarina of Time was 1998, and there's been so little exploration of that kind of idea and then building beyond that kind of idea. And in terms of the universe of gaming, 1990 is a really long time ago. So, it's kind of sad to see that more hasn't been done. But I'm going to show you through this talk a few other outliers that have tried wildly different things, which is really good to see. So that basic mechanic is just learn melodies, work out where to use them. Sometimes it's work out how to use them. And the best example is early on in Loom. You learn a melody that I think winds something up. So then you go and try and use that melody on something which is already wound up, and it doesn't work. So you have to understand yourself as a player. You have to kind of have this expressive, imaginative, narrative relationship with what you're doing with the music and figure out that you have to play the melody backwards to unwind the thing. And to me as a player, that's just that one simple thing. Even if they don't build beyond that, I'm immediately thinking, anytime I get a melody, is this melody the actual melody, or do I have to figure out how to transform that now? Do I have to play it backwards, or do I have to play it in a different order? And so expressively, that's another way to think about expression, is that what's my imaginative engagement with the music? So music is meaningful to the story and atmosphere of the game, but a player's control is limited to button presses of individual notes. And in both cases, it works kind of the same way in both of those games, in that it visually gives you what you need to press, and you just need to press that sequence and remember to do it. Which, if that was the whole game, that's kind of like a game for young children. It's like just do the thing, and then it's too simple. But as I said, in the context of those games, there's all this other stuff going on, so it's really fine. But if we're just abstracting that and thinking about where to take it from there, we can take it a lot further and challenge players a lot more. And we can even challenge players in that, as I'm going to present towards the end, we can have that as a safety net and then gradually take the safety net away, without players even really noticing that that's happening. And when I say safety net, I mean the visual aspect of it. So a story-rich game immediately provides an emotional and atmospheric context for players to ground their own musical explorations and discoveries. So what I mean by that is that I believe that a great story encourages players to play expressively because they have a context that feels like the game, the creator of the game, even if they're not thinking about the creator of the game, they're invited into a place where they feel like that place cares about what they're doing, If you have a game that's just like blaring out all this sound or whatever and it's saying like, come and make some music, it's like being in a conversation with someone who just talks over you all the time, It's like, that person isn't listening to you. So I think that's, in a music game, that's really important to kind of balance that. How inviting is this atmosphere? Like, do people really feel like they're being listened to? And Loom is really interesting like that because even kind of the color scheme has that, the very blue kind of tones and a very enclosed, inviting kind of space. So what kind of musical interactions can we then offer to the player? What else is possible? So just some notable outliers, and there are like so many of these, and I think I shouldn't have picked just two, but these are interesting, and interesting also because I think, does anyone know Oxenfree in here? I want to make sure I get this right. Yeah, that's a Unity game, right? Yep. Yeah, I believe so. Anyway, so Fract OSC is definitely a Unity game. This is really interesting for anyone who's interested in the tech side of things. This uses a visual programming language for music called Pure Data, and it does all real-time synthesis. So it's kind of like people have compared it to like wandering around inside a big synthesizer. And I really like this because the under the hoodness of the game really is that. It's not faking it. And Oxenfree is a really great, way outlier because on the surface, it's a really simple to interact with narrative game. It's all about these kids on an island and you're managing what they're saying to each other, and you're going through a dialogue of a game that just has its own natural momentum and it keeps moving forward. But the actual single puzzle mechanic of the game is this radio, tuning frequencies on this radio that this girl Alex has. So as you go around the island, depending on where you are situated in the island, your radio will pick up different frequencies. And so then you go through this story of, there's an evil presence on the island and the radio can pick up signals and tune in to make certain things happen. So as a puzzle mechanic, it's really simple. It's really easy to interact with because you're just dragging the mouse back and forth to scroll through the frequencies. But what's interesting to me is that it's all about your ears. You can't play this game with the sound off and just fake it. And what, to me, I guess with my background as well, is what I really appreciate about it is that you listen to all the nuances of what it would be like if you really were tuning through a radio. So you hear all the little sideband distortions and all the kind of fun little details, and you're in control of that. Like you're in dynamic control of it. You're not just like pressing buttons to flip from one frequency to another. So it feels very smooth and very dynamic, and then you have this added layer of let's walk somewhere else and see what happens over here. And there are kind of Easter egg type things which are non-essential, but you pick up these visual cues of, if I try it here, I'm going to get something that might not be essential to the story, but let's see what happens. So that's a great example of a simple mechanic, but I think a very expressive one. Expressive in the way that you receive, rather than expressive like I'm being expressive creating my own music. It's kind of the opposite of like I'm listening in a really careful kind of way. So these have highly innovative music-based gameplay in a narrative adventure context. These kind of outliers can help us to expand our palette of ideas of what is possible, and if anyone wants to talk to me about that afterwards, there's so many like great examples of those kind of things out there. So now I'm going to just be quiet for a while and just play some music for you. I'm not going to be doing all of those things. I decided, notably, I'm not going to do any real-time MIDI mapping. But as you saw from the string quartet image at the start, if I was doing that, I would basically just have a small MIDI controller with some dials and faders. On any of those parameters in the game, I could hold down a button and just map a control, and I could map that control to any number of in-game parameters. So for anyone who's familiar with like Ableton Live or that kind of music software, it's exactly the same principle. Okay, I'll move on. Thank you. So, what else is possible? In the real world, musical performance is wonderfully dynamic. We have just a natural tactile control of instruments. When we hold it in our hands, or when we're singing, or however we're music making with an acoustic-based instrument, we have this kind of feedback that's challenging to get digitally. But there are other means of achieving similar levels of moment-to-moment control, and a lot of those which you've just seen. So in that demonstration, I was using envelopes. I was triggering envelopes, doing a kind of granular sampling, which if you want to get technical, I got told off for calling it granular. It's actually not really granular. So envelope triggering of sampling. If we're using synthesis, we can do arpeggiation. Effects processing, you saw a lot of that there. And we can do different things with sample pitch manipulation and all that kind of things as well. So all of those kind of things are also things that, as I'm going to show soon, you can build into gameplay, which is accessible to a non-expert. So as you probably saw in that kind of performance, there's a whole bunch of color-coded things and shape-coded things that are not labeled. There is a way to display labels for what those things are, which, because I know what I'm doing, I don't need those. But even with that happening, it's as hard to use as a piece of electronic music software. So it's a niche thing, and it's not for the average player. And because I believe that it can be, that's what I started to work on, looking at these kind of possibilities. So much more is possible to build into gameplay than people think, and as I'm going to show you, it can be really simple. It doesn't have to be a difficult thing, and going back to Oxenfree again, that's a really great example of how simple that kind of interaction can be. And much of it is very easy to incorporate into gameplay. So the example of the string quartet that I showed you at the start of that piece, that was made in Unity with the default Unity audio, and I was MIDI mapping to the default Unity effects. I don't know what Unity calls them, but like effects or filters or whatever you want to call those. So if you want to even start prototyping that way, if you're not into Wise or Fmod or that kind of thing, it's really easy to do even with like default Unity audio. So again, I said this at the start, but I won't go into kind of the details of the libraries and stuff that I'm using. There's lots of different solutions, and it's really like whatever suits your project. And I'm using a whole mix of things that I'm trying to update to Wise. And as I said, Wise can't quite do it yet, but the Audio Kinetic guys have assured me that it will be able to do it very soon. So what led to the research? So just to dig a bit into my background as a composer-performer, I wanted a really dynamic interface, and I'd always been into games and had dabbled for a long time in experimental games and that kind of thing. So this is an instrument that I made in Max MSP. For any of you who know any visual programming languages, it's like a node-based programming language purely for music. And so for anyone who knows Pure Data, Max MSP is very similar to Pure Data. Pure Data is the free version. So this is the kind of software that I ended up, this was kind of the culmination of years of work. And basically a lot of what you just saw me do in the game came out of this particular piece of software that I made. I wanted everything that this could do for the game to be able to do. This obviously does it at a much higher quality because it doesn't have to deal with 3D graphics and all that kind of thing at the same time. But it has these huge limitations in that if I'm doing that kind of granular processing of samples, I'm having to deal with juggling a bunch of windows on the screen at once. As you can see, if I've got one waveform on the screen, it's already taking up a lot of space. And all of those little colored dots there are MIDI map controls. So there's a whole lot of options for different ways to map things to MIDI. But even so, there's still that level of like, what can I cognitively focus on at once, especially when things are so abstract. So when I perform in a game environment, everything is kind of there laid out, and I can just zoom the camera in or out very freely and get a sense of where everything is and what I'm doing. Whereas here, it's this very clunky kind of like dragging some windows around and trying to manage what I can cognitively deal with. And then when you're MIDI mapping stuff, it's not like a piano where the keys never move. MIDI mapping is different every time, unless you consciously make the decision to map the same controls every time, which in improvisation you would never do. So then that becomes a tricky thing as well, is you only want to map as many like controls as your hands and your mind together can remember what you've mapped. But anyway, the key point that I'm trying to get to with this is that anything that I want to change, I have to be changing at any one moment. I can't set something in motion and let it kind of move around or whatever while I'm changing this thing. And that became a very frustrating thing in improvised performances because I would end up only working with maybe 3 samples at once at most, because otherwise I can end up with some really annoying sound that is bugging me, but I'm doing something else over here, and I want to finish what I'm doing over here before I get back to moving that on. And a game is just a natural way of getting past that interface problem, because even though I didn't use it very much in that performance that I just did, hopefully a lot of you can immediately kind of picture, well, what if I had some physics in that? And what if I had like a bouncing ball and I mapped some music parameters to the X, Y, Z of the bouncing ball, and I could just grab that with the mouse and throw it against the wall. And immediately, I'm not controlling. I can set that, like throw it and then leave it and see what happens and go and do something else while that's going, but I have control over where I threw it. If I throw it into a corner, then I know it's going to bounce this way. If I throw it really hard, then maybe it's going to be more unpredictable. Or if I just roll it, then it's changing a parameter slowly while I go off and do something else. And that's kind of where my thinking started with making a game interface. I started even simpler than that and just thinking of, what if I just use a 2D platformer? And then I've got, jumping and moving around and whatever, and I can presumably, I hadn't mapped any game parameters to musical parameters before, but I just assumed that all that would be possible and easy, and thankfully it was. It also solves another common problem in electronic music performance. So if I'm using a piece of software like this, obviously I'm not going to show that up on a screen while I'm performing, because why would you? But if I'm using a video game, and not just this video game, but any video game that was set up for live performance, it immediately solves that problem. And it's not a problem for you as a performer, but the audience. It's something that the audience, a friendly audience, will tell you about. They'll say that I loved your performance, but it would have been nice to see what you're doing, because we're used to this really long, rich history of going to see a performance and seeing, exactly what a performer is doing, and seeing the nuances of what they're doing and seeing their whole body kind of get into it, which, in an electronic laptop performance, unless they're playing a theremin or something like that, then you're just not going to get that. So that's an example of an early stage of the game. I presented an art gallery, and I had audience interaction as well. So I had 2 iPhones that I could give out and have like a multiplayer kind of collaboration. So not only could they see what was happening on the screen, but if they wanted to, they could choose to come up and join in on the performance. And because I was kind of mediating it, I could prevent anything disastrous from happening, or I could kind of just put someone to the side a bit if they were not so good. But generally, it was just for fun, for people to engage in that kind of thing. So in this kind of framework, I kind of dropped this out of the framework. It used open sound control to communicate from the iPhones to the game, which wasn't super reliable, but I'm sure if any of you are multiplayer or networking experts, you can immediately extrapolate how you could do that really well in this kind of context. So freedom of expression is a key focus for me as a performer. I want to have as many parameters as possible available to me, but as I've already said, you quickly run into that problem of this is how many fingers I have and this is how many different things I can focus on at any one time. And that is a common game designer problem, right? Of we have all these great ideas as game designers and we want to share those with everybody. So do we put them all into the game, and do we just like drip, 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 do a Metroidvania kind of, now you've got this ability and that gives you access to going to find this ability, which gives you access to like mastering that ability and then finding this ability, which can be great, but then that takes away some of that freedom. That gives the freedom, that gives the power back to the game designer and not the player of saying, what do they call it? Like Skinner boxing? Do you guys know what that is? Like I'm just feeding you when I choose to feed you, which is a very disempowering thing as a player. And for me as a player, I don't like when games do that if they don't need to do it. But it also can be very good design if you do it in a way that can be empowering for the player. So simplicity, clarity, and ease of use. Even if, for those of you who aren't designers but are players, it's everything. It's not even just games. It's all the operating systems and phones and everything that we're interacting with on a daily basis. So my solution to this in a roundabout way was to create a point-and-click style interface. Now, I'll show you this in a minute, but basically what it means is including a verb system and a dialogue system and an inventory system into the kind of gameplay that you've already seen. So you can see it's the same world, it's the same avatar. We do have a bit of a GUI, which I tried to avoid for a long time, but at a certain stage, there's just kind of no getting around it. Well, no, that's not true. That's not true. But I decided to go with a minimal kind of GUI. And for a dialogue system as well. As an indie game, I'm not using any VO, so that means having on-screen dialogue. And to the best of my knowledge and my belief is that a point-and-click adventure interface gives you maximum flexibility for expressive relationships between all these things. And not to say that in the history of point-and-click games, that's what it's been about. Because again, that's one of those things that sets itself up as a genre and then kind of locks itself into these ideas of this is a point-and-click adventure, so it should just be these things. But it opens up this massive potential for, as a designer, you can focus the player in on these are the things that you can interact with. How do you want to interact with them? Which is a great thing for player and designer. And so that allowed me to design puzzles in the context of a story where players are introduced to musical concepts little by little. So again, I can't just dump all these musical concepts. I can't, give players like 4 octaves of notes and say, like, you're a musician, like you can do it, And as a side note, you can do that with kids, which is great, because kids don't think about that. If they're young enough, they'll just do it. They'll try whatever. But for adults, that's definitely a major concern because they'll have that, I'm not a musician, I'm not a creative person, or whatever like psychological thing will kick in. And that's why it's really important to kind of like portion out those rewards. And that's not to say all kids, like some kids will think like that. I suppose if you've had like a terrible upbringing where your parents tell you you can't do anything, then you're probably more likely to think like that. And great freedom to musically experiment at each step. And again, that's something that I'm learning as a designer to work on as well. So if I design a puzzle, then I can kind of go back, and I have to balance it because it's one of those things you can go back and tweak forever. But if I design a simple puzzle, then I kind of can go back and go, well, there's no reason why I can't add like a bit more of an expressive parameter in there. But sometimes you just save that for the next game. So about a year ago, after working on this performance framework for 2 years, I looked into narrative gameplay. This was part because in my PhD, I had actually proposed that. And the way that came about, sorry, I'm just checking my time. The way that came about was I thought I was really into improvisation, and I was all about, improvisation is the maximum amount of freedom you can have, because even a classical musician has like these notes in front of them. telling them what to do, you know? So that's the most freedom possible. So then I thought, well, if we can do that with music, which I had already prototyped at that stage and was, you know, it was totally doable. So then I thought, well, we can do it with story. If we're just using in-game text, you can have it kind of like just like a chat that you would have in like an MMO of like, that's a conversation, and a conversation is an improvisation. So that's fine, and that's a kind of narrative, right? And so if people wanted to do a machinima style thing where they had music involved as well, then they could do that. Because you can have microphone input, they could do like a live VO as well and make it into like a musical performance combined with like a radio drama kind of thing. So those potentials were already in there, but that made me think, well, can I have some kind of like puzzle object design performance? And I think it's possible, but you know, I couldn't do it. I would really like to see someone explore that, or maybe explore that in future research. And I think you would need like puzzle geniuses probably to. It's not something that the average person could do. Just like come up with puzzles on the fly and kind of like leave out this trail of objects for someone, for the other player in the game to kind of put the pieces back together. But yeah, hopefully you can all kind of imagine that that is possible. Maybe in an escape room, like a real world context, it might be slightly easier. But even then, it's going to be a very niche experience. So anyway, that was like, research-wise, that was kind of a failure. Like I prototyped it, and it was very difficult, and I immediately just put that aside and said, well, that's not going to work. But I had already, that was like the seed of the point-and-click system. So the code base for that still worked and is still in the game now. So Loom had already set the precedent for musical narrative gameplay. So for those of you who don't know Loom, it takes away the verb system, it takes away inventory, and you can click on things to interact with them, but apart from just a single click to interact, all the other interactions in the game, your whole other mode of progressing through the game is through playing melodies. So that's why I singled Loom out, because Ocarina of Time, there's lots of other kinds of game. You know, there's combat and there's exploration, there's all these other kinds of gameplay. So Loom kind of proved to me that you don't really need anything more than that. You can just focus on that. And so I used that as a point of departure. I started designing a system of melody-based puzzles, and then I started thinking more about Loom and realizing that that's no different from Loom. So I kept a few in there because it is a good place. It's an easy place, even if those melody-based puzzles are difficult, which in playtesting they have been very difficult for a lot of people. People at least understand the concept. Whereas if I start working with signal chains or synthesis or whatever, then it might not be so easy to explain. But it totally depends on the puzzle design. So leveraging everything that you've seen in that kind of performance that I did, I continue to explore what else is possible. So I'm not just thinking about player control, but also musical dialogues. And that's something like that's just starting to dawn on me as a designer of going, well, what a player can expressively do and dynamically do is great, and is great for performance, and is great for their moment-to-moment gameplay. But because I'm thinking about pre-authored game worlds now, then what can the game world respond? I can pre-author like responses. So that means I can have puzzles, but I can also have like secrets and Easter eggs all around the place. So if a particularly adventurous player kind of goes around and just tries playing music to things to see what happens, then I can, really start to author interesting responses to that. And I say that as like a general concept. That's something else that is possible in game design in general, like in musical gaming, that I would love to see. Like I would love to play someone else's game that incorporates that kind of thing in interesting ways. And I guess, that example of Oxenfree, again, it kind of does do that, because it encourages you to, now that you've learned how to tune your radio and pick up, messages, now move around the environment and see what happens when you do it in different places. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very quick demonstration of how a few of those puzzles work. And then I will just about wrap it up, I think, or leave some time for questions. And also to note, there's no composed music in the game yet, so that's still on its way. So I'll just be showing you the puzzle layer of the music. The composed music is going to interact with it and also have this sense of building up. So when you solve certain puzzles, it builds on a new layer of the composed music in the background.
This place is a voice, often silent, but always speaking of the way to hear and speak with the essence of things, with the very presence of nature, about understanding the true nature of things, that which is beyond external appearances, being willing to listen, being willing to listen now. I will only remind you of your own presence. If you ask for my help, I will be.
Okay, I'm not going to listen to all of that because that's kind of like exposition, which we don't need right now. But that also points to another mode of interaction, which is audio logs. So, I mean, I've been talking a lot about music, but really I'm talking about sound. So, and that's another thing that happens later on in this game, is that we start thinking about, here are audio logs, here are voices, you know, here is like language, and maybe it doesn't make sense at first. So we have to figure out how to decode that language or unscramble it in the audio sense. So what just happened there is that I can pull out this instrument here, which is like your character's little handheld synthesizer. And then I have an octave of notes that I can play. And there are certain objects like this statue here, which are basically gatekeepers that will listen to melodies. So you need to know the right melody to play, and they will do something for you, unlock something for you. So this is like another example of how we can implement a melody where we don't have to do a specific interaction. It's just about, you know, if we're running through here, then this is a nice one to see playtesters do, because they don't think it's anything, and they'll run through and hear that the sound happens and immediately make that connection of, okay, I guess I'm supposed to do something here, and then they start exploring. So they just start playing notes. So you can see those lights on the pillar there. Because this is an early puzzle, I designed that to have really simple visual feedback. So like you saw with that very first puzzle that I did, which was entirely visual. The first puzzle that I did, you can do that without the sound on, because it entirely relies on visual feedback. But like I said, it's at least gives players an early sense of reward. So this one you can also do visually, but players generally kind of do both, I think. They kind of see that that's happening and they solve the puzzle. And then if you want to actually solve it properly, you can replace that extra note. But if you're just doing it visually, you can figure it out without replacing that crystal there. So that's kind of placeholder, but ultimately, when we light each beacon, that's going to add to like the global sound. So I'm just going to skip to a little secret part here and just show you one final little one. Oh, well, I'll show you this one too while I'm here. So again, this is just a simple, like, single kind of parameter. So I'm just like dragging the cursor up and down, and it's changing a filter on that sound. And to solve the puzzle, you don't need to know anything about what's happening with the audio. It's just part of the atmosphere of that particular puzzle. So there's no solution to that puzzle yet, but I'm just showing you that as an example of, because I really like this idea, like that's such a simple way, I think, to demonstrate to anyone, and this works really well in playtesting as well. There's another puzzle like this, which is solvable, that it's a really simple framework to kind of go, well, if I drag this thing around, I can hear this thing happening, or maybe if it's subtle, they don't hear it happening, but I can give different clues and different puzzle solutions with this kind of puzzle framework where maybe the audio is important, or maybe the clues will just tell them a configuration of where those objects should be. And that's a really interesting thing for me to explore, because then that's another way of saying, well, it's easy to give clues to what the solution to this puzzle is, but I'm actually kind of just like tricking you as the player into playing with the sound. And then working up to doing those puzzles where you actually really do have to understand what's happening with the sound. But for early puzzles, I think that kind of thing works really well. So that's all I'm going to show you in regards to that. So in conclusion, in terms of musical gameplay, what else is possible? Music is a universal language that can truly empower us as players, and as developers, we have a great opportunity to discover new ways to communicate with players through music. These communications can connect with people on a deeper pre-language level. So when done well, this can still be fun and accessible for mainstream audiences, and I think Ocarina of Time is like the best example of that. There's so many people, I'm sure a lot of you, and a lot of people that you know, but so many people I talk to, it's like that's their favorite Zelda game, or that's this one game that they have like very strong feelings and strong memories about. So I hope you're inspired to discover new and truly co-creative musical connections with your audiences. And like I said, if there's anything about Under the Hood or anything else like that that you want to talk to me about, then, oh, actually we have time for questions now, I think. And then feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards as well. So thank you. So any questions? We've got a microphone down here if anyone wants to ask anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
There, sorry.
That was great, thank you.
Thanks.
I make RTS games, and I'm always amazed at the complexity that our players are able to master. So you have tons of different units. Players are controlling potentially hundreds of units at a time, and the pro-level players are issuing 100 to 200 actions per minute. Have you looked at RTS games for inspiration into what type of controls might be possible musically?
No, I haven't. But yeah, I have definitely seen the footage of pro players and the people comparing that to like classical music in terms of the virtuosic speed that they're performing those actions at. Yeah, it's a tricky thing because it's really down to the kind of interfaces that we have available to work with and how dynamic those interfaces are, which is, for me, that's why I love MIDI mapping. Because even though MIDI is not very high resolution at all, there's nothing really better yet. Open sound control should be better, but it's not really that great, actually, because it just hasn't been widely adopted. So continuous control is what I like. That's what brings me closest to like playing an acoustic instrument. So, and I have no idea about the RTS world if there is some kind of like continuous control solution, or if it's all like keyboard and mouse kind of. I mean, a mouse, like a cursor, is continuous control, but it's only like 2 axes of continuous control. So, yeah, it's tricky, and it's when you have like established genres, definitely people are more willing to like master an established genre than when you're trying to introduce something new to them. But I take your point. It's definitely worth exploring more. So feel free to come up and have a chat if you like afterwards. And thank you again.